incentive auction, but we've got another big auction coming up in November, the AWS-3 auction, which I think is being eagerly awaited by a lot of the carriers who are members of CCA. I wanted to start out by asking about the outlook for the AWS-3 auction and the factors that could make it more or less likely to be a success. And I understand for the government, some of the government people, that might be a difficult question, but if you'd still introduce yourself and say something non-committal, that's fine. So Kathleen, you want to lead off?
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. I hope everybody had a healthy lunch. Compliments of T-Mobile. I'm Kathleen Han, and I head up the Federal Regulatory Group in Washington. Hello? Yeah, there we go. Mic is now on. The AWS auction, the question again was what the outlook will be?
What's the outlook, and what are the things that could make it more or less likely to be a success? Because I think everybody's looking to see what's going to happen with that auction.
Well, first of all, I think it's really exciting that we're at a point in time now where we're actually going to auction this spectrum. It's been talked about for quite some time. The history of this band, actually, and Peter knows this, was this was part of the original 3G reallocation for wireless way back when. And so it's sort of like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again by having this spectrum up for auction. The benefits of this spectrum in particular is that it's adjacent to the existing AWS band. It's globally harmonized, which is a fancy way of saying that, handsets will work in this frequency around the globe. And so I think there are a lot of positives. I think there'll be a healthy turnout for the auction. And I think that, going back to my days of running spectrum auctions at the FCC, it's the best auctions are ones where there are lots of people participating. And so I think healthy participation is going to lead to a positive outlook. I think it's just really exciting that we're at this point in time when we're going to be auctioning this spectrum.
And before we leave you, let me just ask a special question for you, Kathleen. You had a lot of experience with AWS-1 spectrum because T-Mobile went big in that auction. Yeah. What are the lessons, do you think, that were learned from AWS-1 that hopefully the government's learned and everybody's learned that will make AWS-3 a little bit easier and more likely to be a successful transition?
Well, one of the things, we know each other now. I mean, we interacted with the government a lot, clearing the AWS band, and so now that we've been through that, we know a lot of who the players are on the other side. And I think since we've been through it once before, I think it should go smoother this time. So it'd be interesting in what Peter thinks of that, but I think it should go smoother.
Yeah, and Peter, introduce yourself, and then maybe you can sort of respond to Kathleen.
I always tend to find myself, maybe because it's NTIA, my last name. Is that alphabetical order? Yeah. But I'm with NTIA, which stands for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. We're part of the Department of Commerce. We're the spectrum managers for the federal government. So we're facilitating from the AWS-3 perspective, we're facilitating the two bands that are coming from government use, 1695, 1710 at the bottom end of AWS-1, and then 1755 to 1780. Those are the two government bands where there's lots of different federal users right now. And so for the last 2 years, we've been implementing some changes to the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act to make sure that this transition in this auction goes very well, and I think it will go very well. In light of all the lessons learned from AWS-1, Kathleen mentioned our involvement there. I was actually at the FCC at the time, and go back to we both go back to the original auction days, and we've learned a lot over the years. But I think for the most part, we've learned a lot about the need for collaboration between bidders, prospective bidders, and winning bidders and the government agencies. So that's what we're emphasizing, and that's what there's a joint public notice issued by NTIA and the FCC this summer, and then a lot more information came out, including the agency transition plans. There's a DoD workbook with a lot more information to fill in some of the blanks because of the classified or sensitive nature of some of those military systems. So we're all about getting, as much information out to bidders, large and small, and being available to resolve disputes, facilitate collaboration and cooperation between the federal and the non-federal side early and often. We've warned the feds about the collusion rules and how those apply so they don't mistakenly get in between conversations, so we understand they understand the conversations may have to end pretty soon, but they will definitely resume full bore once the auction enters, at an informal stage, and then we've got a period of time where we're going to be moving money from the Spectrum Relocation Fund, the money that's there now, and then the money that's going to be coming in, which will hopefully be a lot, to help the agencies facilitate their transition. And they've been working very, very, very hard to prepare for this transition. So I think it's a bright prospect. And I think the only thing that's going to get in the way of that is if folks don't show up, which I don't think is going to be a problem, because there's two very different bands, and I think the sleeper band is kind of that lower band. It's unpaired, but I think there's going to be some interesting folks showing up for that one.
Okay, let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. I think one of the concerns has been, as the federal agencies have laid out the timetable for transitioning, some of the transition times look like they're kind of long. Do you think that some of those will be pared down as this process moves forward?
Yeah, and so far, the 18 months since we were notified by the FCC of that they were planning to auction the bands off this fall, we've been working hard to basically, one, get the costs down and get the times down as much as possible, and that's happened. There's a new technical panel that was involved in reviewing these transition plans. So these are kind of the starting points for negotiations and discussions. I would say the bulk of the systems are definitely out of the band or secluded at various areas like military training ranges, stuff like that, within about 5 years. So that's going to, but there are mechanisms in place to accelerate that. In fact, we've seen in one instance where DoD has already decided to move some systems to free up Florida much quicker than it would have originally. And there's a possibility that with a little more money from the Spectrum Relocation Fund for some research and development and that kind of things, that things can speed up a little quicker, because it's all about that trade-off.
Okay, Larry, why don't you talk a little about the AWS 3 auction and the outlook at this point, and what does Sprint need?
Well, I'm Larry Krevor, and good afternoon, everyone. Vice President, Government Affairs for Sprint. Actually, I think Peter and Kathleen have covered this pretty well. I anticipate it being a successful auction. Sprint is not in the AWS band today, so it's not quite the same for us as it is for some others in terms of an expansion opportunity of additional spectrum near where you're already operating. And as Kathleen has said, having cleared AWS 1, there's kind of a template now and good relationships and knowledge. Sprint has done a lot of clearing over the years of incumbents to open up spectrum, and what really is important is that you get to know all the different parties and develop a way to do it, work through it, and stay with it. And we've done that in a number of bands. So I think AWS will probably go fairly smoothly. There's a pretty good mapping at this point of where incumbents are and what has to happen. And as people have said, this is the first really larger offering of spectrum at auction in quite some time. I think there is some pent-up demand, so I expect it to be a successful auction that raises a considerable amount of revenue for the Treasury and gets additional spectrum out for commercial use.
Okay, and since that's true, you may not be that engaged in AWS, so we'll ask you an especially hard question on something else a little bit later. So. And from the FCC's perspective, what are your thoughts as you're here, and what are you? I guess maybe a sort of a special question is just what are you going to be talking to people about, and what is the FCC trying to better understand as you're moving into the first big auction in quite a long time?
We're definitely looking forward to this. So I'm Patty Robbins. I'm a legal advisor in the Wireless Bureau at the FCC. And we're definitely looking forward to this auction, one of our Spectrum Act auctions, very big auction. Short form applications, the filing window has opened and applications are due this Friday. So we are looking forward to that, and also for the bidding to start in November. I would echo everything that has already been said. 65 megahertz of a very good spectrum, and a lot of work has gone into this process, and working with NTIA and DoD and other federal agencies and industry to get ready and get us to this point. And we're looking forward to the rest of the process.
Okay, Michael, what are your thoughts on AWS3? Is that something you've been thinking about much from the public interest group standpoint?
Yeah, we've been right in the middle of it. I'm Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future Project at the New America Foundation, which is a think tank in Washington. But we're very advocacy-oriented think tank, and we work with a coalition of consumer media reform, civil rights groups, the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition. And I think AWS3 is a great example of the sort of things we care about. In fact, I think a couple of the folks who've spoken have been too modest about the incredible effort and energy that's going in to try to shape this auction to be something that facilitates more competition rather than simply more spectrum for the two dominant carriers. So an example of the sorts of things we've advocated this whole year, and pretty much sometimes we're a pain in the butt to these guys, but more often than not we're aligned with CCA's members against the two dominant carriers. And this was a great example. We advocated for small license sizes, so in the paired spectrum, 5 megahertz by 5 megahertz. The dominant carriers wanted 10 by 10s, which if they each took that would have left 10 for the whole rest of the industry. The partial economic areas, much smaller than the big economic areas that Verizon and AT&T were advocating. We've opposed package bidding because we think that would basically wipe out small carriers in certain areas where they were willing to pay more for Ps, partial economic areas in their particular location where they really need it to be competitive. And then finally, we've also put a lot of effort as well into actually now I'm blanking on the last thing I was going to say, but this is in terms of the auction rules, just to make sure that they are as competitive as possible. So, for example, that the paired and unpaired portions of the auction run parallel but separately, so that there can't be a gaming, by large carriers who could park their eligibility in the unpaired spectrum, which is not fungible at all, and use that later to swoop in and have an unfair advantage on the paired spectrum, which is far more valuable. So we've been advocating keeping those two sets of rules, the bidding eligibility, the activity waivers, and the closing rules separate. And maybe some others might want to chime in on, but that's sort of the substance of that auction.
Yeah, I'm Ben Moncrief. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for Spire. I don't know that there's a whole lot to add. I agree with everything that's been said. I think one of the most encouraging things to come out of the development of the AWS3 auction was the smaller blocks, the 5 megahertz blocks, which opens up the opportunity for competitive carriers in particular to have a chance at that spectrum. Not to throw cold water on the AWS3 auction, I think it will be successful. I think it'll be in high demand. It is good spectrum. It's still high band spectrum. And so it's great in terms of capacity, but for carriers like Spire, who has a network that's largely in Mississippi and covering rural areas, what we're really focused on is low-band spectrum and the ability to provide high-quality coverage in those vast rural areas where high-band spectrum just doesn't do the trick.
Ben, let me ask you, you're the only really small carrier. I mean, not, and I don't mean that it's an insult.
Number 6.
But, right, but you're smaller than a couple
Yes.
of your brothers. You're not among the 4 major national carriers. What's your sense in terms of to what extent are competitive carriers, the smaller guys, going to be coming in and buying that spectrum, or do you think a lot of them already have a lot of high band spectrum, so there may be not that big of interest among the smallest carriers?
It's tough to tell. I think it's you'd have to go and look at the spectrum portfolios of each individual carrier and the areas they're trying to cover in their depth. For us, we're still evaluating it. I know we don't have much time left to do that, but we're still evaluating it and haven't made a decision. Again, given the areas we serve and what I think a lot of the folks who are number 7 and smaller, the areas they serve, AWS 3 presents a good opportunity to add some spectrum depth. It's adjacent to spectrum they may already operate on. Devices will be available. It's globally harmonized. All those things are in the good column. In the negative column, though, is that coverage issue that most of us face.
One thing I've been thinking about a lot is whether the extent to which AWS 3 is going to come in November, and the FCC keeps talking about having the incentive auction middle of next year. Is that going to be difficult for carriers? And maybe we could ask our carrier panelists, but anybody else who wants to respond, is that going to make it difficult for carriers to rationalize the spectrum that they buy in AWS 3, figure out how it fits up in their portfolio, and then make intelligent decisions about the incentive auction? Kathleen, since you wanted to sit right next to me, you get to go first.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I do think that carriers are going to, and I know we're doing those sorts of, that fellow down there, he's doing that sort of evaluation right now. So I definitely think that's part of the calculus. I think that, for the reasons Ben mentioned, low band spectrum is important. T-Mobile has some low band spectrum, but very little compared to AT&T and Verizon, for example. So that auction is going to be very important. And yes, they're a little bit close in time, but I think the sooner the better for us to get that incentive auction underway.
Okay. Anybody, Larry, do you want to?
Well, I think you can look at it either way. Certainly in the past, there have been times where auctions were spaced fairly closely, and carriers did start to run into problems raising funds and absorbing that much spectrum in a short period of time. So is it a reasonable concern to raise? Sure. But on the other hand, again, we haven't had significant spectrum auctions for a very long time. There's been a very long lead up to both of these auctions. Obviously, the incentive auction has been discussed now for a number of years, as has AWS 3. Tremendous amount of work by the FCC going on with the incentive auctions, which has had immense participation across the industry. So I think carriers do have an opportunity to look at AWS 3. What do you want there? What fits into your portfolio? What fits into your financial plan? And 600. And as Ben mentioned and Kathleen has mentioned, they're different spectrum. Low band spectrum gets you coverage, gets you penetration into buildings, gets you propagation you don't get with higher band. They all have a role in building the best network you can build and serving your customers and with the highest quality that you can. And every carrier has to make their own decisions as to what's the right mix for them given their population and their geography and their wallets. So I think while, yes, they're a little close together, it's not an overwhelming problem given the amount of lead time that everyone's had, to be able to figure out how you want to participate in either or both.
Ben, did you have any thoughts on that?
Just the short answer is I don't think timing is an obstacle. I think Larry's point's right. We've had so much time to prepare for that. Folks that want to do both, we're going to be able to do both.
So let's talk a little bit about, we have another panel tomorrow on the 600 megahertz incentive auction, which is a big deal and has gotten a lot of attention. I wanted to go down the panel and talk about what each of you sees as being the most pressing issues that still need to be resolved and just to make sure that this TV incentive auction is as successful as possible. And as a matter of fairness, we could start on the other end with that.
Sure. Well, I think probably the place to start is with two pending petitions for recon, one from Sprint and one for T-Mobile on the incentive auction, both of which I think have a great deal of merit. You may have noticed some things have changed in the wireless marketplace over the last few months with regard to mergers and acquisition talk. And quite frankly, the chairman and DOJ, I think, got what they wanted. They killed off any proposition of a Sprint T-Mobile merger, and frankly, have done a little bit of a dance on the dead body that may or may not be unfair. But I think that as a result of that, the fact that you're going to have Sprint and T-Mobile trying to participate actively in that incentive auction, it's good that we've got reserve spectrum there. But I think the question is, do you have enough reserve spectrum set aside for competitive carriers, and by that I mean Sprint and smaller, in order to make sure that we all walk away with sufficient low-band spectrum? Because in order to be competitive, no matter what your market is, you're going to have access to low-band spectrum. And I think that T-Mobile's petition that takes a look at the amount of reserve spectrum and different aspects of that is an important thing that the FCC should reconsider in light of market conditions today. And I think that Sprint's petition, which makes the point that I think I've said till I'm blue in the face, low-band and high-band spectrum are different and should be treated as such. Both deserve a second look. Given what's happened in the marketplace in the last 2 or 3 months.
Okay, let's do it this way. Let's let Sprint and T-Mobile respond on their recon petitions, and then Michael, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that your group is that the public interest groups are really concerned about right now. So, what about these recon petitions? Is there any sign that they've got legs at the FCC? I mean, what's the outlook on both of those?
Well, they have been, the commission did put out a public notice announcing them, and I think just today the Federal Register publication dates become available, so oppositions and then replies or comments will be able to happen over the next, in the next 3 or 4 weeks. So we'll kind of see how people react to it. Obviously, I can speak for, I think T-Mobile's petition makes a lot of sense because it really goes to the question of opportunities to get low-band spectrum, and I think it's certainly directionally correct. And in the case of Sprint's petition, obviously it's something we felt strongly about, that the commission, if you're going to look at the competitive impact of aggregation and of mergers and acquisitions and transactions, that you really have to take account of the different spectrum positions of different carriers because they do impact your competitive position. So we think we made a strong empirical case. Obviously, the commission did not agree with us, and we filed the recon because we hope that the commission may see fit to take a second look at it, and we've given them a vehicle to do so. So we certainly hope that it'll get full consideration. I do think that whether you're talking about a larger reserve or whether you're talking about the spectrum screen or any combination thereof, if we're going to try to have 4 national carriers going forward and have competition that way, then the commission has to take the next steps, and that is to try to assure that the market structure and that the inputs are available to make it possible to have sustainable long-term competition. The government's not responsible for any of the carriers doing a good job, but at the same time having access at fair prices to the critical inputs to be competitive long-term, since those inputs are largely controlled through regulation. That's a fair issue, and we hope the commission will look hard at that.
Kathleen, from your perspective, what's the outlook on your recon petition?
Well, I think I couldn't have said it any better than my colleagues in terms of the benefits I think that we're looking to achieve here. I think the commission did a great thing in setting up the reserve. I think what we're asking for is to tweak it somewhat for all the reasons that have been stated. I think, I would also point to the chairman's speech the other day on broadband, where he talked about the need to preserve competition. And, if you want 4 national carriers and their low-band spectrum is important to competition, which the commission acknowledged, then you got to get the mix right. And, depending on how much spectrum's in the auction, you could end up with as little as 10 megahertz of reserved spectrum. And so I think what we're asking is in no event should there be less than 50% of the spectrum should be reserved. And, the way it's set up now, AT&T and Verizon are guaranteed basically 20 megahertz apiece. And we just think it needs to be flipped the other way. They've got plenty of low-band spectrum, and the Department of Justice, acknowledged that. And so I think, what we're asking for is sort of some tweaks on that we think that would help competition, preserve competition, which is what the chairman said he wanted to do. So.
And Michael, I wanted to, we haven't talked at all about unlicensed, but you've been very concerned about unlicensed in the incentive auction and, what's set aside for unlicensed. How are things trending there, and are you pleased with things are right? What are your big concerns if you're, right now as you're looking at that?
Yeah. Actually, let me first just mention very quickly that we agree with, what's just been said about the tremendous importance in the incentive auction of the reconsideration of spectrum holdings, because that really should have been done the other way around.
I do want to say there's a fundamental misunderstanding because these panels work better when people disagree with each other. I guess maybe we should have gotten AT&T or Verizon up here on this.
That's tomorrow's panel.
Well, we may disagree a little on the licensed spectrum.
Right, well, that's good. That's good. That's what we want. So bring it on.
So, the unlicensed community was, I think, was very pleased that the commission, came around at the end to, with an order for the incentive auction that ensures that there will at least be a minimum amount of, kind of a sufficient amount of unlicensed spectrum, low-band unlicensed spectrum, available in every market nationwide. There will obviously be much less unlicensed spectrum. These are the so-called TV white spaces. So unlicensed use of the vacant TV channels that we have today that was first adopted way back 2008, 2010. So we think, but we're kind of just barely on the cusp of that, though. In other words, they're allowing just enough, but it's very contingent on a number of arguments that still have to play out about interference. For example, unlicensed use of the duplex gap between uplink and downlink LTE channels. Is that going to work, given concerns about interference? We think yes, but then we expect some carriers are going to argue, no, that's too risky for the adjacent LTE downlink channels. And the same with sharing TV channels with wireless microphones, for example, on one channel, and with wireless medical telemetry on another channel. And then there's the other thing we're very happy to have accomplished is a promise that the further notice of proposed rulemaking, which apparently will be coming out September 30th, we hope, will also revisit some of the unlicensed rules for the ongoing TV band. So this will be the part of the, the channels that continue to be vacant on the TV band after the auction. We think there could be a much more robust access to using those channels for unlicensed, and offload plays this incredibly important role in the whole ecosystem. So, we think everybody should get behind it.
Okay. I wanted to, let's move off auctions since we're supposed to be covering a fairly broad list of issues here.
Oh. I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I love auctions.
Here's an issue that you're going to love talking about, and that's spectrum sharing.
Oh, yeah, I love that too.
It seems like on some levels that's kind of a sleeper issue. I mean, it's been one of the big focuses of the Obama administration has been sharing. And Peter, maybe you can talk about why sharing is so important and why is the administration promoting that so heavily?
Well, I think we've realized, and I think pretty much everybody's realized, that going forward, it's going to be harder and harder to clear spectrum. Because this is on the federal side, where do they go? And how much is going to cost and how long is it going to take? So with the increase in technical capabilities of radio systems to be smarter and smarter, database systems. Others say, well, let's look at the sharing approach that as an access regime as opposed to clearing, basically as the default. The law still does provide, this is a change from 2012, to first look at clearing options. So we'll be doing that. But when those options just aren't feasible for technical or economic reasons, then we're going to look at sharing. So as we're looking at bands going forward, the 3.5 gigahertz band is one where it's a shared band which may be auctioned. So auction and sharing is not mutually exclusive. So you can have auctions. The question is, what kind of sharing do you have, and how dynamic can you get it based on the technology, whether it's a database type technology that's being advocated for 3.5 or more of a sensing approach, which has been used already in 5 gigahertz band, unlicensed bands for dynamic frequency selection, or even more sophisticated approaches like in the TV white spaces where the databases and or sensing can be used. So it's really about relying more, having more faith in the technology, but developing that technology and provided ways to test it, evaluate it. We've enhanced our capabilities out in Boulder, Colorado to do that. So we're going to try to have as many sandboxes as possible so that the unlicensed, licensed sharing approaches, can be tried as an alternative to the clearing approach, which has just become so hard. It's hard now.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, because you did work for a company that was very involved with dynamic sharing. I think one of the concerns that carriers have expressed is that the tools that are available and dynamic sharing is just not good enough yet. And what's your response to that? I mean, how much progress is being made in that area?
A lot of progress is being made in that area. I'm not just speaking from my old company. But it takes execution. The technology is, might be great, but it takes execution, and there's cost benefit analysis, and there's time. When's the right time? So, at the same time, people are questioning, dynamic spectrum access technology. They were touting the benefits of something called LTE, which I think was at the same stage of maturity, but they were still falling on their swords on it. And now it's become kind of the de facto standard. People were saying the same thing about WiMAX and stuff like that. Look what happened there. So I was involved in the GSM versus CDMA battles. Remember those? Who won those? So anybody talking about the technology and the faith in technology got to question their motives and their incentives, right? So maybe they already put their bet down on other types of technology. Maybe it's not in their business interest to be, sharing spectrum with their competitors. So you have to kind of penetrate those kind of issues and figure out maybe are there other business approaches, that would favor those kind of technologies. And so that's why you've got, like I said, the sandbox opportunities in 3.5, 5 gigahertz to show and demonstrate, that these things are feasible, in the right context, under the right business scenarios.
I wanted to ask our carrier people on the panel. It seems to me like there's been some movement, at least, where carriers are embracing sharing more than they did 3 or 4 years ago, and there's sort of more of a recognition that sharing is going to be part of the equation. Wondering how does it fit into your plans for spectrum use down the road? Where you want to start?
Okay. It's hard to disagree with any of that because it sounded really reasonable. So
Damn, should have stayed with the company.
It's hard to disagree. I'm been in this for a long time, so I'm not against sharing. My only concern, technology may solve it, and we've all seen technology do amazing things. I was at a conference years ago when a former FCC commissioner said, hey, this is it. They were allocating some of the top channels, the public safety channels at 800 megahertz, and the former commissioner said, this is it. That's it. There's no more spectrum. This is as high as you can go. You guys better really learn to use this efficiently. Well, that was 800 megahertz, and now, you know, we're doing 2.5 and 3.5 and 5 gigahertz and on. So, and of course down into broadcast channels. So obviously, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and technology finds ways to use the spectrum more efficiently constantly. So I guess my view would be I am concerned about interference, you know, coming from the Sprint Nextel part of the world. We have a lot of familiarity with interference from things nobody anticipated at 800 megahertz. We've worked very hard to make that go away and fix it, and we have with the cooperation of the public safety community. So when we talk about sharing, I'm a little nervous in that regard, but again, open to new technologies, new ways of using spectrum, because the bottom line is true. There is only so much spectrum. We can't make more. So we've got to use what we have efficiently, and sharing is going to have to be one of the tools in the toolbox. I view it a lot like automobiles. You know, there are people who hate electric cars and they want to see them go away and just have gas, and there are people who think gas cars should be banned and we should have electric. And my personal view is we're going to need a variety of ways to power vehicles, whether it's, you know, electric and gas and diesel and liquefied natural gas and fuel cells. We're going to need everything going down the road, because not one approach is going to satisfy all the needs we have. And I think the same thing's true with spectrum. We obviously want exclusive use spectrum, and that's desirable and better. We've gone from making channels narrower to making them very, very big now. We used to talk about kilohertz wide channels. Now we're talking about 20 and 40 megahertz wide channels to support video and data intensive applications. And so sharing is not something we should ignore, and see when it works, how it can work, and then how we can use it in commercial applications. And if it doesn't work well, we've got to stay with exclusive. But I think, again, you got to look at everything.
And Kathleen, T-Mobile's been very involved with the Commerce Spectrum Advisory Committee and its work on sharing. Tell us why.
Because we want to spend time with Peter Tenhula. No, I think the CSMAC process, as it's called, and Steve Sharkey, who's sitting down there, has spent a lot of time and will continue to spend time working with the federal government users of spectrum. I mean, there is this sort of arbitrary divide between federal and commercial, and I think that divide is kind of coming down, and we're increasingly in each other's space, if you will. And so I think good spectrum management is about, I think, commercial users talking with the federal users. The federal government has a lot of spectrum, and I think there are ways that we can learn from one another and improve spectrum efficiency. And certainly that was our experience with clearing the AWS band when we were involved in that. Our interaction showed that there were ways that the government could do things differently. It forced them to reevaluate some of their spectrum use and digitize some of their spectrum use that was analog, and improve their performance to boot. So that's a lot of what's going on in the CSMAC, is, I think, sharing of ideas and improving spectrum management.
And Michael, we do have one CSMAC member who's on our panel. Michael, why don't you talk about what are the big issues that still are ahead for CSMAC, and how much progress do you think has there really been made sort of quietly on working through these sharing issues over the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, so I can't remember if we sounded out the acronym. It said the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee. So
on first reference, I gave it.
It advises Peter and his colleagues, very diverse group. And yeah, and I think actually we've made a huge amount of progress. And it's really important to understand that this is really, and this is a point Peter was trying to make, I think, early on, is on 2 parallel tracks. The administration is trying to both clear spectrum where possible for exclusive use and share spectrum that's very underutilized, but where the federal agencies aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And so that's a really important distinction. The 1755 to 1780 band is an example of the former, where the sharing will be transitional sharing to exclusive licensing. And so that's just involving kind of, it's between the carriers and the government, and the CSMAC played a real convening role in trying to figure out how you could do that. And hopefully there's, I think there are some models developing in Europe on a 2.3 gigahertz band. They're talking about licensed shared access for the same purpose, a band that will ultimately just be licensed. But then there are other bands that, it took us 3 years to get the 25 megahertz at 1755 to 1780 through this process, and it'll take more years to transition it. But there's other bands like, as Peter mentioned, the 3550 to 3700 band, 150 megahertz of spectrum, where the Navy and other federal users aren't going anywhere. They're going to stay there with the radars and our Aegis cruisers and so on. But that spectrum is grossly underutilized, and the FCC is in the process of opening it up for dynamic sharing on both, and this is important, on a small cell basis. So it diversifies the ecosystem of spectrum out there, and it'll have both licensed and unlicensed. So priority access licenses, and then on other spectrum, and also where there are no licensees, unlicensed use they call general authorized access. So the CSMAC has been kind of working through the issues that arise on both of those parallel tracks for more spectrum. But I think this is exactly the right way to go, as Larry was saying, I guess both gas and electric.
And Patricia, we haven't really heard from you in a while. Why don't you want to talk about sharing from the FCC's perspective, and also maybe any sense of where we're at on 3.5 gigahertz sharing band, because that's something that I think there's a lot of interest in right now.
Sure. Well, like a lot of things that we've talked about already, I can echo a lot of what's already been said, and that the FCC is very interested in continuing to find spectrum for exclusive use, but also interested in other tools in the toolbox for sharing, whether it's geographic or time-based, or with federal users, or among various commercial users, licensed and unlicensed. So we're certainly working forward on all of those avenues, and the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding is certainly something that's been a priority and we're working on, and I don't have any other insight on timing for you, but
Okay.
Certainly something that folks are very interested in at the Commission as well.
Okay. And let's talk about one other issue, and then we'll throw it open to, I know that we've only been able to get into a couple of issues so far, but I know that for the CCA, universal service is a very big issue, and there's concerns about whether wireless is viewed by the FCC as a satisfactory substitute for wireline. Maybe we could start out by the industry people talking about that a little bit, and then Patricia, if you want to respond to it. But Kathleen, do you want to go first this time on USF?
Well, I'm going to point to Ben maybe
Sure.
to speak to that, because I think...
Sure. I mean, from C-Spire's perspective, and I think speaking for pretty much every CCA member, there is certainly everybody smaller than us. There is no issue more important than USF reform right now. I'll just throw a couple of facts on the table that I think often, well, three things I want to say. First, it's the wrong question. Not that you asked the wrong question, but I think the wrong question continues to be asked, which is wireless a replacement for wireline? That's the wrong question. Is wireline a replacement for mobile broadband? Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. In places, just look at the states that have the highest penetration of wireless-only households. The top two are Idaho and Mississippi. Number 3 is Arkansas. These are not urban strongholds. People in rural America depend on mobile broadband to access the internet, to get their business done, to educate their children. Mobile broadband is their solution. And so that's fact number 1. Fact number 2 that I keep coming back to, the last time it was reported, which was in the CAF order, 44% of the monies that are paid into the USF fund come from wireless. 22% come from ILECs, right? So we're paying in twice as much as they are. And under the current plan with the mobility fund, we're going to get 1/10 of the money back. $500 million. That is inequitable and makes no sense given utilization of mobile broadband, particularly by people in rural America. So those are two facts on the table I think we can't lose sight of. And then the story behind that is for nearly a decade, consumers, predominantly wireless consumers, have made an enormous investment through the USF fund and through high-cost support in the deployment of mobile broadband in rural America. 8 years, a little more. And that investment is out there in terms of facilities that are operating today. If you take away the high-cost support, you take away the funds that are available to operate those towers. And you're going to wind up with a bunch of rusty towers in rural America. And that's not good for those rural customers. That's not good for the economies and the broad swaths of the geography of the United States. And it's very important, I think, that we all take a step back from the calf order and examine what's being done to harm mobile broadband through the reduction of USF. It's a very important issue to us, and I'm a little cranky about it, if you can't tell.
Yeah. But the cranky is good in the context of one of this panel. Last week, Chairman Wheeler gave a speech about, it was like the big broadband speech on Thursday, and he did talk about wireless a little bit, and it was in the context of wireless is still not a robust enough substitute for wireline yet. Is there anybody who had a cranky reaction to that? That I like that concept.
My daughter did.
Your daughter didn't like it,
She didn't like it.
and I hope she read about it in Communications Daily.
I don't think so. I think it was Teen Beat.
And as a matter of fairness, Patricia, I know this isn't one of your big issues at the FCC, but is there anything? Do you have anything that you wanted to say on behalf of the FCC and USF and what Ben said?
Well, sure. Well, I can. As you said, the chairman last week in his speech on broadband did talk about wireless broadband as well, and that at this time it's not a full substitute for fixed broadband, but we are interested in looking for advancements that can help with that. And the further notice, the proposed rulemaking for CAF does seek comment and wants to examine further issues related to could some of these funds, as long as you're meeting the minimum threshold requirements for speed and the performance requirements for the mobility fund, could service providers use wireless, satellite, other types of technologies and still qualify?
And Chairman Wheeler will be here this afternoon, so he can answer for himself on all these things.
That's absolutely right. He can
So
provide more
you
insight.
didn't
on
want to say
broadband.
anything that would have preempted the chairman, am I correct on that? So,
Of course, of course.
just kidding. So do we have any questions from the audience? I know we've kind of dashed around and we've done a little bit on a bunch of issues, but we're interested in what issues might be foremost on your minds that you'd like to, the whole spectrum of big wireless issues. Are there any questions? There's a question, I see a hand.
Hard to
It's
see.
hard to see back there, but I think there's a hand that went up back there. I detected movement of some kind anyway.
I just wonder if you have any thoughts regarding FirstNet spectrum and the sharing opportunities there from the carriers?
Well, they have, FirstNet has some very good spectrum, and, I think it is something that, and it's low-band spectrum, so I think there are opportunities there for the carriers, certainly, and I think all of us have probably had discussions with them. I think the challenges are around how the networks are built and controlled, and from the carrier's perspective. And that's what we do. We build and develop networks. So it is not something that the government does a lot of. And so I think the challenges for the carriers are going to be, I think, that dialogue around the network build and control, I think.
Isn't it true, and Larry, maybe you could talk about this too, but there's a lot of strictures on FirstNet right now and the way it's set up that is making it very difficult for them to have, adult conversations, shall we say, with the carriers.
Well, you know,
The damn NTIA.
it's a great question because it actually goes to this issue, for example, of sharing. And, you know, there's federal spectrum and there's public safety spectrum and there's commercial spectrum. And certainly, and actually T-Mobile and Sprint both back in the D-Block arguments were looking at this together along with a coalition of other carriers as to how could we share better with public safety. But I think you do have a number of obstacles. First of all, there's the mindset that public safety needs to control their own spectrum, and you have to kind of figure out, okay, if you're going to use it for commercial and public safety, what are the triggers when public safety has to ramp up capacity? And as a commercial carrier, can you, it's not a matter of not letting people on the network in IP, it's a matter of prioritization. Will some of your commercial customers have their data sessions slowed down, for example, because in a particular location there's a ramp up of public safety activity. So you have to be willing to work those things out. I think different carriers have different viewpoints on whether you could do that. And actually now with a new subject, it may actually touch on net neutrality because, you know, if you were sharing and you were prioritizing public safety under certain circumstances and managing your network that way, what would that do vis-a-vis net neutrality concepts? So it's pretty complicated. There also have been in the past technical issues about incorporating that spectrum, even though it's great low-band spectrum, into networks that already have 700 megahertz in them. I think those are getting resolved over time. So it's something that carriers have been interested in a number of times over the past 4 or 5 years. But I think FirstNet's kind of got some of its own issues right now before it gets to that.
Peter, I'm sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just checking my handy CCA app for, put a plug in for a briefing that's coming up. I think there's a FirstNet briefing scheduled for tomorrow, is that, you know,
Yeah.
Wednesday?
Wednesday.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
So-
Your app wasn't quick enough.
So we certainly don't want to steal
And
thunder from
so I
you.
don't want to steal thunder from that, so I recommend attending that. But I also do want to remind folks, it was interesting that one of the, going back to kind of the first questions and tying it all together is that, you know, what's one of the policy drivers for these two auctions coming up, AWS3 and the 600 megahertz, are the funding of FirstNet. So to the extent that AWS3 can satisfy a lot of those funding needs, the earlier the better. That would be great. Maybe take some of the pressure off the incentive auction to produce, you know, the revenues and pursue other policy objectives surrounding that. But you know, FirstNet is as Kathleen was talking about this line between federal and non-federal blurring. Boy, that's a perfect example of it.
Really is.
And also with regard to sharing, what are we talking about sharing? Are we talking about network sharing? What network elements? Or are we just talking about pure spectrum? And is there an advantage that that FirstNet kind of has by having the ability to lease it and things like that, at least you know, what kind of flexibility there. I'm not involved in that at NTIA. There's other folks like, you know, Marcia McBride and Steve Fletcher and the FirstNet folks. But I just wanted to remind folks that, hey, show up to that AWS3 auction and FirstNet will be happy.
Right. And like with a lot of these issues, they're not getting, the issues aren't getting simpler as they're coming up, you know, issue by issue. I think we have time for one more question, and so it's going to be the last question, so there's a little pressure for it to be a very good one, but go ahead.
Yes, recently the T-Mobile petitioned the FCC to help define the term commercially reasonable in the roaming mandate.
Yeah.
And this is probably a question for Patricia. Do you have any idea when we can expect a response from the FCC?
So the comments, I think the reply comments were due August 20th for that, and staff is actively looking at it. I assure you, probably even now, and that's as much of the information I have. I mean, we are looking at it and actively working on thinking about whether there's should be more information about what is commercially reasonable, and we're looking at the arguments that were provided in that docket.
Yeah.
I'm guessing Kathleen might have something to say about this topic.
Yeah, no, I'm pleased that you're actively looking at it. I mean, I think we tried to put together a very thoughtful petition to the commission. In the original data roaming order, the commission envisioned that there would be opportunities for declaratory rulings to put some meat around things, such as what constitutes commercially reasonable. And that is a new standard, and it is something that, we've had a few years of experience now with the data roaming order, and we think there's a ripe opportunity for the commission to clarify. And we came up with certain benchmarks to help the commission, and we got overwhelming support for our petition from small carriers. And I think the only opposition really was from AT&T and Verizon. No surprise there. And so I think this is something that I think, again, falls into, I think, Chairman Wheeler's speech in terms of something that he can do to benefit and preserve competition. Roaming is, as you all know, is very critical to our businesses, and all of our customers want to be able to use their devices wherever they are. And so if you want ubiquitous broadband and you want competition, you absolutely have to have roaming that works. And right now, at least T-Mobile's experience is we have one particularly large roaming partner who is bilking us, if you will, and I think, there's an opportunity, I think, for the commission to make some clarity around these rules that I think will benefit not just T-Mobile, but all the small carriers.
Ben's company is the number 6 carrier. I don't think that's the one you're referring to. But
We're not
I wonder.
often accused of being a monopolist, but never quite get there.
I don't exactly.
And others may want
don't-
to chime in on that.
I guess
don't know.
we're not putting a name on the bilker, right?
Yeah, yeah.
'Cause they didn't do it this morning during the LTE thing either. And Michael, it looked like you had something to say down there. What did you want to have kind of a final
Yeah,
word?
one of
Because we got to
these-
wrap this up.
One of these hybrids of, maybe it's agree and disagree, I don't know, but we filed comments actually supporting the petition. Certainly the benchmarks would be a real improvement, for example, comparing wholesale rates to what, foreign carriers would have to pay and so on. At the same time, though, we pointed out that this could, is a real case study, we think, in terms of where the commission's going kind of astray, because if you look back at voice and SMS text roaming, right? In 2007, the commission classified the exchange of voice and text traffic as Title II. In other words, between the carriers, Title II service. And so there was a roaming mandate. It's been simple and it's worked really well. Now we get to 2011 and they tried this convoluted Rubik's Cube of commercial reasonableness, and it's complex, it's cumbersome, and it's not working. And so we just think that they could have classified that as, we believe, as that exchange of traffic again as Title II, and it's a really interesting example of how Title II could actually work to the advantage, we think, of the non-dominant carriers.
Okay. Well, I think we really should, it's a good idea to end your sessions on time while people are still in the room. So thank you all for attending, and thank you all for being on our panel today.
Thanks, Howard.